"There is one more item," the lawyer said, looking down at his folder and then back up at me. "And your stepmother left very specific instructions about it. It does not go to the family, it goes only to you. And she asked that you open it alone." I sat in that small office and felt the room tilt. My stepmother and I had not exchanged a warm word in 50 years. We had been, for the whole of my life, two women circling each other behind a wall of cold politeness. And now she was dead, and her will had reached the end, and the very last thing it did, the final act of a woman I had spent 5 decades resenting, was to single me out. Me, the stepdaughter who never let her in. I could not imagine what she could possibly have left me, or why it had to be opened alone, and I want to tell you that whatever you are imagining right now, it was not that. It was something I had been wrong about for 50 years. My name is Eleanor Hartwell. Most people call me Ellie. I am 60 years old, and I have run a small antique shop in Richmond, Virginia for most of my adult life, which means I have spent my whole career as a keeper of other people's old and precious things. I am going to tell you about the woman I called my stepmother, the woman I blamed for erasing my mother, and I am going to tell you what was inside the thing she left me, because the day I opened it was the day I learned that for half a century, I had been grieving the wrong loss and resenting the wrong woman. To understand what that sealed bequest did to me, you have to understand the story I had been telling myself since I was 6 years old. So let me tell you the story the way I believed it, the way I had believed it, without a crack, for 54 years. My mother, my real mother, my first mother, was named Evelyn, and she died when I was 6. I will not dwell on the how. It was an illness, and it was fast, and it took her in a season. I was too young to be told much, and too young to keep much, and that is the central wound of this whole story, so I need you to hold on to it. When my mother died, I was 6, and a 6-year-old does not get to keep her mother. I had a handful of blurred images. The smell of something, a song maybe, a coat. That was my entire inheritance of Evelyn, fragments, already fading, held in the unreliable hands of a small, grieving child. And then, a little over a year after my mother died, my father remarried. Her name was Frances, and Frances moved into our house, into my mother's house, and that, for me, is where the 50-year story begins. I should tell you, before I go further, who Frances actually was, in plain facts, because the facts matter, and the child I was never bothered to learn them. Frances had not been married before. She was not a young woman looking for a household to step into. She was nearing 40, settled, with a quiet life of her own, when she met my widowed father and his grieving little girl. She did not have to take us on. A woman of 40 with her own life does not, by accident, end up raising another woman's traumatized child. She chose it. She chose, with both eyes open, to walk into a house thick with grief and a child who would, she must have known, fight her every single day. I never once, in 50 years, asked myself why a person would choose that. I simply assumed she had gotten what she wanted. It did not occur to me until I was 60 years old, sitting in a storage unit, that what she had wanted the entire time was simply us. I want to be honest with you about what kind of child I was to Frances, because the honesty is the price of this story being worth anything. I was not a wounded innocent, and she was not a wicked invader. But for 50 years, I told it exactly that way. And here is how it went. I did not accept Frances. I want to say it plainly. I was 7 years old when she arrived, and I had just lost the only mother I would ever have, and into that raw and open wound walked a calm, capable, soft-spoken woman who was asked to be my mother now, and every cell in my 7-year-old body refused her. It was not a decision, it was a reflex of grief. To let Frances be kind to me felt, to that child, like a betrayal of Evelyn. To call her anything warm felt like helping the world forget my real mother. So I held her at the end of a long, cold arm, and I called her Frances, never anything else, and I built a wall, and I spent my entire childhood adding bricks to it. I want to give you one memory, because it tells the whole of what I was like with her. I was perhaps 9. I had a school event, something small, a recital, and Frances had spent an afternoon I did not know about sewing me a dress for it, by hand, carefully, the kind of thing a mother does. And when she gave it to me, folded and pressed and hopeful, I looked at it, and I looked at her, and I said, "My mom would have bought me one." I was 9. I watched the words land on her face, and Frances did not snap at me, and she did not cry in front of me, and she did not put the dress away. She just said, quietly, "Then let's to think this one as from both of us." And she helped me into it, and she did up the back, and she sent me off to my recital. I wore the dress. I never thanked her for it. I told that story to myself for 50 years as proof of how cold the house was. I understand now that it was proof of something else entirely. And here's the thing that turned my private childhood grief into a 50-year grievance. The thing I built the rest of the wall out of. Sometime in the first year or two after Frances arrived, the house changed. The photographs of my mother came down off the walls. Her things, her clothes, her books, the small particular objects that had been hers, disappeared from the rooms. The house stopped containing Evelyn. And no one explained it to me, and no one asked me, and I was a child, so I did the only thing a child can do with a fact that size. I assigned it a cause. And the cause I assigned was Frances. That became the bedrock of everything. Frances, I decided, had erased my mother. She had walked into Evelyn's house and taken Evelyn's husband and Evelyn's daughter and Evelyn's life, and then she had quietly, deliberately taken Evelyn herself, swept the photographs into a box, cleared the shelves, scrubbed the rooms of the dead woman so she could occupy the space cleanly. To my child's mind, and then to my teenager's mind, and this is the tragedy of it, to my full-grown adult mind, Frances was the woman who had stolen my mother twice. Once by marrying into her place, and once by erasing the last traces of her. So I never forgave her, and the not forgiving lasted my whole life. I was polite. My father was alive for many of those years, and I loved my father, and I would not make war in his house. After he died, the politeness simply continued out of habit, a cold and formal courtesy stretched over 50 years. I went to holidays. I sent cards, signed with my name and nothing else. And the whole time, underneath, I held the verdict. This woman erased my mother. My half-sister Barbara, Frances and my father's daughter, my father's second family, Barbara grew up watching me hold her own mother at arm's length, and that put a frost on the two of us as well, so the wall I built around Frances ended up enclosing half my family. I called all of it loyalty. Loyalty to Evelyn. For 50 years, it felt like the one pure and honorable thing I had ever done. And I taught it, too. That is the part I am most ashamed of looking back. I had children of my own, and they grew up with a grandmother, Frances, who came to everything and was never quite let in. And they absorbed, the way children do, that there was a coolness there, a reason, a thing their mother did not discuss. I never told my children Frances was wicked. I want to be accurate, but I did not have to. Children read the temperature of a room. They learned that Frances was kept at a careful distance, and they learned it from me, and so my 50-year verdict did not stay mine. It became the family's quiet inheritance. By the time Frances died, there were people at her funeral, my own grandchildren, who had only ever known her as the grandmother you were polite to. That was my doing. I had not just held a grudge, I had handed it down. Frances died last winter, at the age of 89, and I went to the will reading the way I had gone to 50 years of holidays, politely, distantly, expecting nothing. And then the lawyer reached the last item and said the word alone and handed me a small flat key and told me where to go. The key was for a storage unit, a small one on the south side of Richmond that Frances had apparently rented and quietly paid for, the lawyer said, for a very long time. For decades. None of the family had known it existed. And her instruction, written into the will in her own careful words, was that her stepdaughter Eleanor was to go to that unit alone, and that what was inside it belonged to me and to no one else, and that she was sorry it had taken her so long to give it to me. I drove out there the next morning. I did not tell anyone. I sat in my car in front of a metal door for a while, because some part of me was braced. I thought perhaps this was Frances having the last word, some final cool gesture I would have to decode. Then I unlocked the door and rolled it up, and the morning light went into the unit, and I stood there, and I did not understand for a moment what I was looking at. And then I did. And my knees genuinely went, and I had to put a hand on the doorframe. I want to be honest about what I expected, sitting in that car, because the expectation tells you how deep the old story ran. I genuinely thought, and I am ashamed of it now, that the unit would contain something cold. Some final correction. Maybe documents proving she had been right about something, some old argument settled in her favor. Maybe just my father's things, sorted and labeled, a tidy administrative goodbye. Even at the very end, with a key in my hand and her last instruction in my ears, I could not imagine that a unit Frances had kept secret for decades would contain an act of love. That was the measure of the wall. After 50 years, my imagination had simply lost the ability to picture Frances doing something kind. I had to actually see it, in the morning light, before I could believe it was possible, and even then my body believed it before my mind did. My knees understood before I did. The unit was not full of furniture or junk or the leavings of an old woman's life. The unit was full of my mother. It was Evelyn. Everything that had vanished from our house when I was a child, every photograph, every book, the clothes, the small particular objects, it was all here. Not discarded, not destroyed. Kept. Boxed with care, labeled in Frances's handwriting, stacked and protected and dry and clean. 50 years of careful keeping. The photographs of my mother that I had believed Frances swept into a trash bin in 1971 had been in this room the entire time, in albums, in order, preserved. There were boxes marked Evelyn, letters. A box marked Evelyn, her mother's things. A box marked simply, for Ellie when she is ready. I sat down on the concrete floor of that storage unit, a 60-year-old woman, surrounded by my dead mother, and I understood, slowly and then all at once, that the entire story of my life was built on a foundation that had never been true. Frances had not erased my mother. Frances had saved her. Frances had been the keeper of Evelyn for 50 years, and I had hated her for it. I stayed in that unit for hours. I could not make myself leave. I opened the album marked with the earliest years, and there was my mother's wedding, my mother's young face, my mother holding a baby that was me, photographs I had not known survived, photographs I had assumed, for 50 years, were in a landfill somewhere because the wicked stepmother had thrown my mother in the trash. And every box was labeled in Frances's hand. Not hurried, not careless. The handwriting of a person doing something with love and with patience over a long time, expecting no one to ever see it. I ran my fingers over the words, Evelyn, her garden things, on the side of one box, and I thought about how many of my cold Christmas cards Frances had received in the years she was quietly paying rent on this room. I had been signing my name and nothing else to a woman who was, at that very moment, somewhere across town, keeping my mother safe for me in a locked unit she would never mention. There was a letter. Of course there was a letter. It was in the box marked, for Ellie, when she is ready, sitting on top, and it was the last thing Frances ever wrote to me, and it explained everything, including the one question that mattered most, which was, if she saved all of this, then why, in 50 years, did she never once tell me? I am not going to read you the whole letter. Some of it is mine. But I will tell you what it said, because Frances, in the end, in her own quiet handwriting, finally told me the truth of my own childhood. She wrote that when she married my father, the photographs and the belongings of my mother came down off the walls, and that this was true, and that it had happened, and that I had not imagined it. But it had not been her doing. It had been my father. My father, she wrote, was a man drowning in a grief he had no idea how to carry, and his way of surviving it, the only way he could find, was to not see it. He could not walk past Evelyn's photograph every morning and keep functioning. He wanted the reminders gone. He wanted, Frances wrote, to start clean, because starting clean was the only thing keeping him upright. And so, my father was the one who took the house apart. My father was the one who wanted Evelyn put away. And Frances, the new wife, with no standing, no history, a woman who had walked into a house full of another woman's grief. Frances disagreed. She believed, she wrote, that a little girl was going to grow up one day and need her mother, need every scrap of her, need the photographs and the letters and the proof that Evelyn had been real and had been loved. And so Frances did something quiet and, I now think, extraordinary. When my father said throw it out, Frances said yes, and then she did not throw it out. She took it, every photograph, every letter, every object my father wanted gone, Frances quietly carried away and kept, first in her family's attic, and then, for decades, in a storage unit she paid for out of her own money, year after year after year, and never told a soul. She let my father believe Evelyn was gone because that was what he needed to stay alive. And she kept Evelyn safe because that was what she believed I would one day need to live. And the question, the why did you never tell me question, Frances answered that too, and her answer is the part that I will carry for the rest of my life. She wrote that for the first years, I was simply too young. A grieving child cannot be handed a storage unit of her dead mother. She would only have been rewounded, so Frances waited for me to be ready. But then, she wrote, the years went by and I grew up, and the trouble was that I never softened toward her. Not at 10, not at 20, not at 40. And Frances came to believe, rightly or wrongly, that if she came to me and revealed what she had done, I would not receive it as love. She was afraid, and she wrote this very plainly, that I would think she was using my mother's memory to buy her way past my wall. That I would see 50 years of careful keeping as a manipulation, a final, clever move by the stepmother to make me owe her something. She wrote, I could not bear to have the one good and pure thing I did for you, Ellie, be turned into a transaction. So I decided I would rather you receive it when I was gone, with no way for me to benefit from it, so that you would know it was only ever a gift. She had kept the secret of her own kindness for 50 years, rather than risk having it mistaken for a bribe. She had decided the only way I would believe she loved me was to tell me from beyond her own grave. I have read that part of the letter more times than any other, and every time it does the same thing to me, because think of what it cost her. Frances spent 50 years being cast, in her own home, in the heart of her own stepdaughter, as the woman who threw a dead mother in the trash. 50 years, and the entire time, she held in her hands the one fact that would have exonerated her completely. A single revelation that would have rewritten her, instantly, from villain to hero. Most of us could not keep that secret for a month. The temptation to clear your own name, to be seen correctly by someone you love, is one of the strongest pulls a human being feels. Frances felt it every day for 50 years, and every day she chose silence, because she had decided that being seen correctly mattered less than the gift staying pure. I do not know if I have ever encountered a stronger act of will. She let me believe the worst of her for half a century on purpose, so that the day I learned the truth, there could be no doubt left in it. I spent the next several weeks doing something I had never been able to do in my entire life. I met my mother. I was 6 when she died. I had fragments. And now I sat on my own living room floor, 60 years old, and I went through the boxes Frances had kept, and Evelyn assembled herself in front of me, piece by piece. There were photographs of her as a young woman, laughing, that I had never seen, that I could not have seen because they had been in a storage unit my whole adult life. There were letters she had written, in her own hand, so that for the first time since I was 6, I could hear the rhythm of how my mother actually thought. There was a box of her own mother's things, my grandmother's things, a whole maternal line I had been cut off from. The blurred fragments I had been guarding so jealously for 50 years, the half-remembered coat, the maybe song, I could finally set them down because I no longer needed the fragments. Frances had kept me the whole woman. There was one letter in particular. It was a letter my mother Evelyn had written, near the end, when she knew she was dying, and it was not addressed to me, it was addressed to my father, but it was about me. In it, my mother asked my father to make sure that whoever came after her, whoever helped him raise their daughter, would be someone who understood that a child needs her history kept. My mother, dying, had asked for exactly the thing Frances spent 50 years secretly doing. The two women never met. Evelyn died before Frances ever entered our lives, but sitting on my floor, I held a letter in which my first mother asked, into the future, for the precise act of love my second mother would go on to perform in silence. And I had spent my life with a wall between me and the only person who had answered my dying mother's last request. And here is the unbearable irony, the one I had to sit with on that living room floor. For 50 years, I had believed I was being loyal to my mother by hating Frances. I had believed the wall I built was a monument to Evelyn. But the wall had done nothing for Evelyn. It was Frances, the woman on the other side of the wall, the woman I was freezing out in Evelyn's name, who had actually, practically, with her own hands and her own money and 50 years of her own silence, preserved my mother for me. My loyalty had been a feeling. Her loyalty had been a storage unit. I had spent 5 decades performing devotion to Evelyn, while the real devotion to Evelyn was being quietly done, unthanked, by the very person I was performing it against. Once the foundation goes, the whole building has to be re-examined, and so I made myself do the hardest thing, which was to go back through 50 years and look at Frances again, at all of it, with the truth finally switched on. And a different woman emerged from those 50 years. I made myself remember the things the old story had needed me to ignore. I remembered that Frances had never, not once, said a single unkind word about my mother to me, and I had taken that as coldness, as her not caring, when in fact it was a woman carefully protecting a dead rival's memory in the heart of a child who would not even look at her. I remembered that Frances had come to every event of my life, every graduation, every opening of my shop, every small thing, and stood at the back, and I had read her quietness as obligation, when it had been, I now understood, simply love that had been given no warmer place to stand. I remembered 50 years of a woman absorbing my coldness, my clipped cards, my long arm, and never once retaliating, never once withdrawing, never once saying the thing she had every right to say, which was, "I am keeping your mother safe for you, you ungrateful girl, and you will never know." She took all of it. She took 50 years of being cast as the villain in a story she could have ended with one sentence, and she chose, every single day, not to say the sentence, because saying it might have cheapened the gift. Frances was not the woman who erased my mother. Frances was a woman who spent 50 years quietly mothering a child who would not be mothered by her, and who, denied every ordinary expression of that love, found one extraordinary one, and gave it the only way she could, silently, at her own expense, and posthumously. And I thought, finally, about that hand-sewn dress, the one I was 9 years old when I refused to thank her for. I had carried that memory for 50 years as evidence for the prosecution. See how cold the house was, see how little it meant. Sitting with the truth switched on, I saw the same memory completely differently. A woman had spent a hidden afternoon sewing a dress for a child who she knew, with near certainty, would not be grateful. She did it anyway. And when that child said the cruelest thing a child can say, "My real mother would have done better," that woman did not retaliate and did not collapse. She said, "Then let's think of this one as from both of us." She made room in that sentence for Evelyn. At the exact moment I was using my dead mother as a weapon against her, Frances was gently insisting that my dead mother be included, be honored, be kept in the room. I had been handed, at 9 years old, a perfect demonstration of exactly who Frances was. It only took me 51 years to read it. I want to be careful and fair here, because it would be easy to end this by simply turning the old story inside out. To say I was the villain now, the cruel stepdaughter, and Frances the saint. But that is not the truth either, and Frances herself, in her letter, would not allow it. Frances wrote, near the end of her letter, a line I keep close. She wrote, "Ellie, do not spend whatever time you have left being angry at the girl you were. She lost her mother. She was doing the only thing she could." Even from beyond her own death, even in the document that finally revealed how badly I had wronged her, Frances's instinct was to protect me, to reach forward and shield me from the guilt she knew the truth would bring. That is who she was, all the way down. Not a saint. Just a woman whose first reflex, in every circumstance I have ever been able to examine, was the gentleness of the other person before herself. Because the 7-year-old who built the wall was not a villain. She was a child whose mother had just died, and who could not, must not, be blamed for failing to open her arms to a replacement. That child was doing the only thing her grief permitted. I have made my peace with that little girl. She owes no apology to anyone. But I was not 7 for 50 years. And that is the thing I have had to hold. The reflex of a grieving child is forgivable completely. But somewhere in those 5 decades, I became an adult, and an adult has the power the child does not. The power to go back and check the story, to ask the questions, to wonder out loud, is it possible I have this wrong? I never did. I let a 7-year-old's verdict stand for 50 years without once reopening the case, because the verdict had become comfortable, because hating Frances had become part of how I knew who I was. The child built the wall out of grief, but I, the grown woman, I was the one who kept it standing, year after year, long after I had the capacity to walk around it and look. The grief was not my fault. The 50 years of incuriosity were. Frances was gone. That is the cruelty at the center of this. The same cruelty I have learned sits at the center of so many of these stories. The truth arrived too late to be given to the person who most deserved it. I will never get to tell Frances that I know now. I will never get to call her anything warmer than Frances. That chance died last winter, and no storage unit can give it back. But there were things still in my power, and I have done them, and I am still doing them. I went to my half-sister Barbara, Frances's daughter, and I told her everything. I told her that the frost I had kept between us for 50 years had been built on a lie about her mother, and that her mother had in fact been the finest and most quietly honorable person in our whole family, and that I was sorry, more sorry than I had words for, that I had not known it in time to be kind. Barbara and I are not strangers anymore. At 60 and 58, we are becoming, late and carefully, sisters. That is Frances's doing too. Even gone, she is still mending things. Barbara told me things, in those first long conversations, that I had never known, because for 50 years I had kept her too far away to tell me anything. She told me that Frances had talked about me constantly, privately, all those years. That Frances kept a folder of every notice that ever ran in the paper about my antique shop. That when I had been sick, years ago, Frances had not slept and had wanted to come, and had not come only because she believed her presence would not be welcome, and she had been right that it would not have been, and that is the thing that guts me. My half-sister sat in my living room and handed me 50 years of a love I had refused delivery on, parcel by parcel, and I understood that the wall I built had not only kept Frances out, it had kept Barbara out, and her children out, and a whole half of my own family out, and I had stood inside it calling the loneliness loyalty. And I told my own children and grandchildren the true story, both true stories. I gave them their grandmother Evelyn, finally, properly, out of the boxes. And I gave them the truth about Frances, that the woman they had vaguely understood to be the step-grandmother their mother kept at a distance was, in fact, a hero of our family, and that they were to know her that way now. I have put Evelyn's photographs back on a wall in my own house where they should have been all along. And beside them, I have put a photograph of Frances. The two mothers of my life, side by side at last, both of them loved, both of them late. A year has passed now. My mother Evelyn lives in my house now, not as a fading fragment, but as a whole, remembered woman, because Frances kept her whole for me. I know my mother's handwriting. I know her laugh from the photographs. I have, at 60, more of my mother than I had at 7, and that is a gift of such strange and enormous proportions that I am still learning how to carry it. And Frances lives in my house too now, in the photograph on the wall, and in the truth I tell about her, and in the slow rebuilding of everything her silent 50 years made possible. I grieve her. That is the part that still surprises me, that I, who spent 50 years cold to Frances, now grieve her with a real and aching grief. I grieve the holidays I sat through with my long, cold arm. I grieve the warm word I never gave her. I grieve, most of all, that she went to her grave having decided that the only safe way to be loved by me was to wait until she could no longer be there to feel it. I have made my peace with the shape of it, as much as a person can. I cannot give Frances the 50 years back, but I can be, for whatever years I have left, a true keeper of her, the way she was a true keeper of my mother. I can make sure that the story told about Frances, from now on, down through my children and theirs, is the true one. The keeper kept. It is late. But it is not nothing, and I have learned that late but not nothing is the realest kind of grace there is. I go and sit with both of them sometimes, in the room where the photographs hang. My mother Evelyn, young and laughing in pictures Frances saved, and Frances, in the photograph I chose for her, one Barbara gave me, of Frances in her garden, in her 60s, squinting into the sun, looking ordinary and patient and kind. I look at the two of them, and I think about how strange it is that the great love story of my life turned out to be between these two women who never once met. Evelyn, dying, asked the future to keep her daughter's history safe. Frances, arriving into that future a stranger, heard the request she could not possibly have heard, and answered it, and spent 50 years answering it. They were, the two of them, a relay, one mother handing something precious forward into the dark, and another mother, decades on, catching it and holding it and waiting for me to be ready. I was not ready for 50 years. They waited anyway, both of them. That is the kind of mothering I was given, and did not see, and have only now learned how to receive. I want to leave you with the two things this taught me. The first is about the stories we build in childhood and never reopen. A child, in pain, will reach for an explanation because an unexplained loss is unbearable and a child needs the world to make sense. That is not a flaw, it is survival. But a child's explanation, formed in grief, with half the facts and none of the wisdom, is not a verdict. It is a guess. And the danger is that we carry those guesses into adulthood and let them harden into bedrock, and we organize 50 years of feeling around them, and we never once go back and ask whether the frightened 7-year-old got it right. If there is a person in your life you have resented since childhood, a step-parent, a relative, the one the family cast as cold or difficult, I am asking you to do the thing I did not do. Reopen the case. Ask, as a curious adult, what actually happened. You may find the bedrock was only ever a child's best guess, and that a real and patient love was standing on the other side of your wall the whole time, waiting. The second thing is about how love is sometimes shaped. We expect love to be warm and spoken and obvious, hugs and soft words and presence we can feel. And so, when love arrives in a colder-looking shape, we very often fail to recognize it. Frances's love for me did not look like love. It looked like a quiet, distant, formal woman, and a storage unit I never knew about. It was, in fact, one of the most profound acts of love I have ever encountered. 50 years of unthanked, unwitnessed, deliberately hidden devotion. So do not only measure the people who love you loudly. Look, too, at the quiet ones, the ones at the back of the room, the ones absorbing your coldness without complaint. Ask what they might be keeping for you, out of sight, at their own expense. The loudest love is easy to see, but it is very often the silent keeper, the one you blamed, who has been carrying the most. If this story landed for you, drop the word keeper in the comments below. I read them. It tells me which stories are worth telling next. Subscribe for new stories, real patterns, full narratives, the long game. 2 small pieces of wisdom from this one, before I go. First, a grievance formed in childhood deserves, at least once in your adult life, a fair retrial. The child who first judged that person was doing their best with a child's understanding and a child's information, but you are not that child anymore. You have the capacity now to ask the questions the child could not ask, to gather the facts the child never had. Do not let a 7-year-old run your relationships for the rest of your life. Reopen the case at least once. The truth can survive being examined. A lie often cannot. Second, learn to recognize love in its quiet and unflattering shapes. Not everyone who loves you will do it warmly or out loud, or in ways that feel good to receive. Some of the deepest love you will ever be given will look, from the outside, like a cold and distant person doing something you never even find out about. Before you decide someone does not love you, ask what they might be doing for you where you cannot see it. The person you have written off as cold may turn out to be the keeper of the most precious thing you own. Look twice at the one you blamed. I'll see you next time.